The desert air was still that morning, too still. In Dusty Creek, the silence before sunrise carried a weight that pressed against the lungs, heavy and suffocating, like a storm crouched on the horizon waiting to strike. The sun had not yet climbed high enough to bake the sand, and a thin veil of cold clung to the wooden buildings, the saloon shutters, and the hitching posts along the dirt road that served as the town's main street. The only sound was the faint creak of a sign above the mercantile, its chain groaning each time the wind nudged it. Dusty Creek was not a place of grandeur. No railroad had yet reached its borders. No governor or official from the capital had ever set foot here. It was a frontier town, little more than a cluster of wooden buildings and corrals, clinging stubbornly to the edge of civilization. The townsfolk were farmers, ranchers, drifters, gamblers, and a handful of souls who thought they could outpace their sins by burying themselves in the desert. But Dusty Creek had a way of dragging sins into the open. Always. Sheriff Eli Carter stood on the boardwalk outside his office, a black hat pulled low over his brow. He lit a cigarette, the flame of the match briefly illuminating the lines of weariness carved deep into his face. His badge glinted faintly on his chest, though it was tarnished, scratched from years of service. He had been sheriff here long enough to know the rhythm of the place, the bar fights that spilled into the street, the cattle rustlers who thought they could drive stock through the dry creek bed at night, the endless disputes over land and water rights. He had stared down his fair share of gunmen and buried more friends than he cared to count. But this morning felt different. The stillness wasn't peace, it was dread. Even the dogs lying in the shade of the livery seemed restless, ears twitching at sounds only they could hear. A raven perched on the gallows beam across from the jail, its black feathers glinting in the early light. Eli had learned to trust the silence, to fear it. The quiet before something breaks is always the loudest. Inside the jailhouse, Deputy Will Hensley shuffled papers on the desk. Young and eager, Will still wore his badge with a kind of pride Eli had long since lost. He leaned back in his chair and said, "Mornin', Sheriff. You look like you didn't sleep a wink." Eli exhaled smoke, watching it curl upward into the pale morning sky. "Didn't." Will raised an eyebrow. "Trouble on your mind?" Eli didn't answer right away. His eyes drifted to the horizon where the desert stretched endlessly, the mesas and ridges painted purple by dawn. Somewhere out there, a storm was riding. Not of rain, but of dust, gunpowder, and blood. He could feel it in his bones. "Word's been comin' in," Eli said at last, his voice low. "Cole Braddock's ridin' this way." The name hung in the air like a shadow. Even Will, too young to remember Braddock in his prime, went pale. "Cole Braddock," he whispered. "The Cole Braddock." Eli nodded. Will whistled, shaking his head. "I thought he'd disappeared. Folks say he's been in Mexico, hidin' from bounty hunters. Others said he got himself killed in Arizona." "Men like Braddock don't die easy," Eli said. "He's comin', duh." And with that, the first stone of fear dropped into the well of Dusty Creek. By mid-morning, the town had begun to stir, though the usual clamor of cattle wagons and children's laughter was subdued. The saloon doors swung, but only a trickle of patrons entered, most of them there to trade nervous gossip rather than drink. The blacksmith hammered half-heartedly at a horseshoe, his strikes uneven, as if each clang was a question. Would Dusty Creek still be standing tomorrow? Eli walked slowly down the street, spurs jingling faintly, eyes shifting from face to face. He saw it everywhere, the unease, the suspicion, the fear. Some townsfolk gave him encouraging nods, others avoided his gaze altogether. He couldn't blame them. Law in Dusty Creek was only as strong as the man wearing the badge, and Cole Braddock had a way of making even strong men falter. The saloon's piano was silent when Eli pushed through the swinging doors. Abigail Lane, owner and mistress of the establishment, polished glasses behind the bar. She was a woman whose beauty carried a kind of weariness, like a rose that had bloomed too long in the sun. Her auburn hair was pinned loosely, and her sharp green eyes flicked up as soon as Eli entered. "You heard?" she asked, her voice steady but carrying a note of something unspoken. "Yeah," Eli replied. Abigail set the glass down, pressing the rag against the counter. "Cole Braddock's ridin' into town, and he ain't comin' for whiskey." The saloon was nearly empty, but those who sat at tables shifted uncomfortably at the mention of Braddock's name. One gambler muttered a curse, Another spat into his cup. Eli leaned against the bar. "Word is he's callin' me out." Abigail's gaze softened, though her jaw tightened. "Then it'll be sundown, won't it? That's when he likes to settle things." Eli didn't answer. He stared into the mirror behind the bar, at the reflection of himself. His hat shadowed most of his face, but he could still see the tired eyes, the faint scar above his cheek, the weight of years. Behind him, in the glass, Dusty Creek looked small, fragile, just wood and dust and men with too much pride. "Eli," Abigail said softly, "don't do it." The sheriff's eyes flicked to hers. "You know I have to." "No," she snapped, her voice breaking through her calm veneer. "You don't. You could ride out. Leave before he gets here. Dusty Creek ain't worth dyin' for. Not after all you've given it." Eli's lips curved into a bitter smile. "If I ride, Abigail, he'll burn this town to the ground. You know that as well as I do." Abigail's hands trembled as she gripped the counter. She opened her mouth to speak again, but stopped. Behind her eyes, Eli saw something deeper, fear not just for the town, but for him. And maybe, though she wouldn't admit it, fear of Braddock himself. As the day dragged on, the whispers grew louder. By noon, every man, woman, and child in Dusty Creek knew Cole Braddock was coming. Some shuttered their homes, some sharpened knives, and others fled, hitching horses and wagons to escape before the outlaw arrived. The afternoon sun baked the street into shimmering waves of heat. Dust rose with every step, clinging to clothes and throats. Eli returned to his office, where Will was pacing like a caged animal. "You can't face him alone," Will blurted. "Braddock's got men, half a dozen at least. Let me ride out, get help from neighboring towns." Eli shook his head. "By the time you get back, it'll be over." "But—" "No buts, Will. This is between me and him." The deputy clenched his fists. "Why? Why you?" Eli leaned against the wall, staring at the cracks in the wood as if they could answer the question for him. "Finally," he said, "because we started this a long time ago. And it's got to end with us." Will didn't understand, not fully. But Eli saw the truth written in the younger man's face. Fear, admiration, and a dawning realization that Dusty Creek might be about to lose its sheriff. That evening, the town gathered in the saloon. The piano played slow, uneasy notes while men drank faster than usual, hands twitching near holsters, eyes darting at the door with every creak of the wind. Outside, the desert sky bled into shades of red and purple, the sun sinking low, shadows stretching long across the street. And somewhere beyond the horizon, Cole Braddock was riding. The outlaw's reputation was legend. Some said he once shot 6 men in less than 10 seconds. Others swore he could ride through Apache territory alone and come back with scalps. Mothers used his name to scare their children into obedience. And yet, there was always a kind of admiration too, for Braddock was no ordinary killer. He was charm and danger, wit and savagery, all bound in one man. For Eli, though, Cole Braddock was not legend. He was flesh and blood, memory and betrayal. They had once been as close as brothers, bonded by youth and fire. Until the day it all fell apart. Until blood stained their hands and their paths split forever. Now, fate was bringing them back together. Eli sat alone in his office as night fell, lantern light flickering across the room. He removed his revolver, laid it on the desk, and began the slow ritual of cleaning it. Each bullet slid into place with a metallic click that echoed in the silence. His hands were steady, though his heart carried the weight of inevitability. He pulled a sheet of paper closer, dipped his pen in ink, and began to write. The words were slow, deliberate, heavy. A letter, though to whom it was addressed, Abigail, Will, or perhaps the town itself, was unclear even to him. All he knew was that it might be the last thing he ever wrote. Outside, the raven on the gallows shifted, letting out a low, guttural caw. The desert wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of dust and distant gunpowder. Eli Carter looked out the window into the darkness, knowing tomorrow the sun would rise on a town forever changed. And far beyond Dusty Creek, in the black sea of the desert night, a figure on horseback rode steadily toward the town, his eyes fixed, his mind set, his hand never far from the grip of his revolver. Cole Braddock was coming. The next morning, Dusty Creek awoke to a sky the color of brass. The desert sun rose fast and hot, spilling molten light across the town's rooftops, baking the dirt road into a shimmer of heat. By midday, the town felt like a furnace. Dust clung to boots, sweat stung eyes, and every creak of a door or jangle of spurs made people flinch. It was a day made for bad omens. And then they saw him. From the north trail, where the desert road curved around a ridge of sandstone, came a small cloud of dust. At first it was faint, barely more than a smear against the sky. But as the hours wore on, the smear grew larger, darker, until the outlines of riders appeared against the horizon. Horses moved in a slow, deliberate line. Shadows stretched before them, long and sharp like blades. The townsfolk gathered in doorways and behind shutters, staring out with the wary silence of cattle sensing a predator. Children were pulled indoors, shop signs flipped to closed, and rifles were quietly checked behind counters. Everyone knew who it was. Cole Braddock had come back to Dusty Creek. Braddock rode at the front, his horse a black stallion with a scar down its flank. He sat tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, his hat tilted low enough to shadow his eyes. Dust clung to his coat, but his presence seemed untouchable, as though the desert itself had been waiting for him. Behind him came 6 men, each hard-eyed and armed to the teeth. They were his gang, faces known in wanted posters across the territories. To the left was Hank Marrow, a sharpshooter with a hawk's gaze and the patience of a rattlesnake. To the right, Big Caleb Bear Jensen, a brute of a man who could break a man's neck as easy as a twig. The others, Slim, Red, Walker, and Boone, were cut from the same cloth. Killers, thieves, men who lived and breathed on the edge of law. The gang slowed as they reached the edge of town. The horses snorted, hooves sinking into the baked dirt. The sound of jingling spurs and leather creaks carried down the street, echoing in the silence. Windows slammed shut. Doors locked. And yet, behind every curtain, eyes watched with a mixture of fear and fascination. Cole Braddock pulled back his reins at the center of town, directly across from the saloon. He scanned the buildings, the quiet street, the air itself. His jaw tightened into the faintest of smirks. "Well," he drawled, his voice deep and gravelly, carrying across the empty street, "Dusty Creek hasn't changed a bit." Inside the saloon, Abigail Lane froze with a glass in her hand. The gambler at the nearest table whispered, "God help us," before draining his whiskey in one swallow. The piano player stopped cold, hands hovering above the keys as if playing another note might provoke the outlaw into violence. Abigail closed her eyes for just a moment, steadying her breath. Then she straightened her shoulders and stepped out from behind the bar. She had always known this day might come, though she prayed it never would. Braddock's shadow stretched across her past, and now it was standing right outside her door. Sheriff Eli Carter stood on the boardwalk outside his office when Braddock dismounted. For a moment, the 2 men simply stared at each other across the distance. It had been nearly 15 years since they'd last stood face to face, but time had not erased the recognition. Eli saw the boy he once knew buried beneath the outlaw's hardened features. He remembered the reckless laughter, the wild nights when they were young and thought themselves invincible. But that boy was gone. In his place stood a man forged by blood and betrayal. Braddock let the silence stretch, letting every eye in town soak in the moment. Then he tipped his hat ever so slightly, the smirk never leaving his lips. "Afternoon, Sheriff," he said. "You look like hell." Eli didn't blink. "You look like trouble." The outlaw chuckled, a sound that sent shivers through the watching crowd. "Ain't that the truth?" The gang spread out, tying their horses to posts, swaggering into the saloon, the blacksmiths, anywhere they pleased. Dusty Creek shrank in on itself as Braddock's men claimed it piece by piece. The law, for the moment, was nothing more than a tarnished badge on Eli's chest. Braddock stepped closer, boots crunching on the dirt. He stopped just shy of the sheriff's office, his eyes narrowing. "You know why I'm here." "I can guess," Eli said evenly. Braddock's smirk widened. "Then let me spell it plain. Sundown. Tomorrow. You and me. Right here in the middle of town. One shot to settle it once and for all." Gasps whispered through the crowd hiding behind windows. The outlaw's words carried the weight of prophecy. Eli's jaw tightened, though his voice remained calm. "And if I say no?" Braddock leaned closer, his shadow falling across Eli. His voice dropped, low and venomous. "Then I burn this town to ashes. You know I will. Ain't a man here can stop me." Eli held his gaze, searching for some crack in the outlaw's armor, some flicker of the boy he once knew. But there was nothing. Only the cold certainty of a man who had already decided his fate. Finally, Eli gave a slow nod. "Sundown." Braddock stepped back, satisfied. He tipped his hat again and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Then Dusty Creek gets a show." That night, the town buzzed with fear. In the saloon, the piano stayed silent, and the air was thick with smoke and whispers. Abigail stood in her office above the bar, staring out the window at the street below. She could see Eli walking slowly down the road, his shadow stretching long in the lantern light. Her heart twisted with something between fear and anger. She had known both men once, known them in ways that tangled her heart with theirs. But the years had changed everything. Cole had become legend, Eli had become law, and she had become the woman caught between them. She whispered to herself, "This town is going to bleed." The next morning dawned bright and merciless. The gang had taken over the saloon, drinking and laughing as though they already owned the town. Braddock sat at the corner table, Boots on the chair opposite, eyes sharp as ever. He spoke little, but his presence filled every inch of the room. Deputy Will stormed into the sheriff's office, slamming the door behind him. "We can't let him set the rules. He's playin' this whole town like a fiddle." Eli leaned back in his chair, exhaustion in his eyes. "It's already set. Sundown today." Will's fists clenched. "Why you, Sheriff? Why not raise a posse? We could surround him, take the fight to his gang before sundown." Eli shook his head. "That's what he wants. He don't care about the gang. He don't care about the town. He cares about me. This started between us, and it's gonna end between us." Will sank into a chair, frustration written all over his face. "Then tell me, Sheriff, what the hell happened between you two?" Eli didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted to the badge pinned to his chest, then to the revolver resting on his desk. The memories burned too sharp, too raw to speak aloud. Finally, he said quietly, "Once upon a time, we rode together. We were brothers. Then one night, a job went bad. Folks died. He blames me, I blame him. And we've been ridin' toward this moment ever since." Will swallowed hard, realizing that Dusty Creek was about to witness the climax of a story older than most of its citizens. By late afternoon, the town looked like a stage set for tragedy. Every building was crowded with hidden eyes, every corner heavy with dread. The sun slid lower, casting the street in long shadows. Time itself seemed to slow, the minutes stretching into an eternity. Eli stood alone outside his office, revolver holstered at his side. His hat cast a shadow across his eyes, and his jaw was set like stone. The townsfolk whispered prayers behind shuttered windows. And then, as the sky burned orange, Cole Braddock stepped into the street. He walked slowly, boots raising small puffs of dust. The silence was absolute. No horse, no bird, no sound but the steady rhythm of his steps. He stopped halfway down the street, turning to face Eli. His eyes gleamed with a mixture of rage and triumph. "This is it," Braddock said, his voice carrying across the town. "One last dance, old friend." Eli's hand hovered near his holster, every muscle coiled tight. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. The night before sundown was the longest night Dusty Creek had ever endured. The air was heavy, hot, and suffocating, as though the desert itself was holding its breath. Lanterns burned in every window, casting long, flickering shadows across the dirt street. Families whispered in hushed tones behind shuttered doors, children pressed against their mothers' skirts, fathers sitting with rifles across their laps, though they knew no bullet could stop what was coming. Sheriff Eli Carter did not sleep. He sat alone in his office, the clock ticking endlessly on the wall, each second dragging him closer to a destiny he could not avoid. His revolver lay on the desk before him, polished until the steel gleamed in the lantern light. He stared at it with the hollow eyes of a man who understood that by tomorrow it might be the last thing he ever touched. Deputy Will had tried to keep him company, but Eli had sent him home hours earlier. "You're too young for this wait," Eli had said. "Go to your family, Will." Whatever happens tomorrow, Dusty Creek is gonna need men who still believe in tomorrow. And I'm not sure I'll be one of them. And so Eli sat in silence, listening to the faint hum of the desert wind, and remembering. The memories came unbidden, like ghosts creeping through cracks in the floorboards. He saw himself, 15 years younger, riding hard through the canyonlands with Cole Braddock at his side. Back then, they were inseparable. Two young men chasing the same dream of freedom, of making their own rules in a land that seemed endless and untamed. They weren't yet outlaws. Not exactly. Just boys who had grown up poor, hungry, and tired of being stepped on by ranchers, railroads, and bankers who seemed to own everything worth owning. Cole had been the firebrand, the one with the silver tongue and the reckless courage. Eli had been steadier, the anchor. Together, they thought they could take on the world. And for a while they did. He remembered their first real score, a stagecoach run carrying payroll for a silver mine. They ambushed it in the red canyons west of Dusty Creek, pistols drawn, hearts hammering with both fear and excitement. The job went smooth, almost too smooth. No one died. They split the gold, laughing under the stars like boys who thought themselves kings. But fortune has a way of sharpening appetites. The memory shifted, darker now. A saloon in Bisbee, whiskey flowing, Cole at the table spinning stories that drew in every drifter and outlaw within earshot. He spoke of big scores, railroad shipments, government payrolls, banks fat with money. He had a way of making danger sound like destiny, of turning crime into a kind of poetry. Eli had followed because he couldn't turn his back on Cole. They had sworn brotherhood, back when they were kids, two orphans who promised they'd never leave each other to face the world alone. But the line between brotherhood and betrayal is as thin as desert dust. The night that broke them came back sharp and merciless. It was a job they never should have taken, a robbery at a rancher's home just outside Prescott. Cole swore the man was crooked, a tyrant who cheated settlers out of land and water. "We'll be robbin' the robber," Cole had said, his grin wild. "It'll make us rich, Eli, and no one will shed a tear for the bastard." Eli had doubts, but he rode anyway. They stormed the ranch at midnight, bandanas over their faces, guns drawn. But the rancher wasn't alone. His family was there, his wife, his children. The robbery turned to chaos. The rancher drew a shotgun, Cole fired, and in seconds the floor was slick with blood. Screams filled the night. Eli tried to stop it, shouting, begging Cole to pull back, but the bullets kept flying. When it was over, the rancher lay dead. His wife wept over his body. A boy, no older than 12, stared at Eli with wide, tear-streaked eyes that would haunt him forever. Cole wanted to torch the place, to erase the evidence, but Eli grabbed his arm. "This ain't what we are, Cole. This ain't justice. This is murder." Cole's face had twisted in rage. "Don't you preach at me, Eli. You knew what we were ridin' for. You wanted the gold same as me." Eli shook his head, sickened by what they had done. "Not like this. I won't carry this blood on my soul." Cole spat at his feet. "Then you ain't no brother of mine." That was the night Eli rode away, leaving Cole to the darkness. He turned himself in to the nearest marshal, confessed everything, and bargained for his freedom by testifying against Braddock. Cole escaped before the law could hang him. But he never forgave Eli. And from that night forward, their paths were set, Eli walking the road of law, Cole carving his legend in blood and fire. Now, as Eli sat in the dim light of his office, those memories weighed on him like chains. He pulled the letter he had written the night before from his pocket and read it again. It was meant for Abigail, though he hadn't written her name at the top. "If you're readin' this, it means I didn't walk away from sundown. I don't know if I deserve your tears, but I reckon I'll die hopin' I do. You were the best of Dusty Creek, Abigail, better than me, better than Cole. If I fall, remember me not for the badge or the gun, but for the man who once dreamed of peace in this broken land." He folded the letter carefully, tucked it into an envelope, and placed it in the top drawer of his desk. Then he stood, strapped on his gun belt, and walked out into the night. Across town, in the saloon, Cole Braddock drank whiskey with his gang. Laughter echoed through the room, crude jokes, the crash of glasses. But Cole himself was quiet. He sat apart, staring at the flame of a lantern, his mind wandering not to victory, but to the past. He remembered Eli as a boy, skinny, stubborn, with eyes that always seemed to see right through him. Eli had been the only one who could ever call him a liar to his face, the only one who could match his fire with steel. And when Eli turned on him, when Eli betrayed him to the law, something inside Cole had broken. Not because he feared the gallows, but because his brother had chosen the badge over blood. Now, 15 years later, the wound still burned. Sundown tomorrow wasn't about glory. It wasn't even about Dusty Creek. It was about proving that betrayal had a price. Cole drained his glass, set it down hard on the table, and whispered to himself, "Tomorrow, Eli Carter dies." The dawn of the final day broke red and brutal. The desert sky looked painted with blood, and the sun rose heavy and merciless. The whole town of Dusty Creek seemed to stand still, waiting. Even the animals sensed it, the horses restless in their corrals, the dogs pacing nervously in the alleys. Sheriff Eli Carter stood outside his office as the sun climbed higher, his hat shadowing his eyes. The townsfolk watched him from windows and doorways, whispering prayers or curses, depending on which way their loyalties leaned. For some admired Cole Braddock. They saw him not as a villain, but as a man who defied the bankers, the ranchers, the politicians who bled them dry. To them, Braddock was a symbol of freedom. To others, he was a devil who brought only death. And Eli, he was the line between the two. Abigail came to him just before noon, her face pale, her eyes fierce. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice breaking. "Leave, Eli. Ride out before the sun sets. Let him take his revenge on me if he must, but don't throw your life away." Eli shook his head. "If I ride, Abigail, the town dies. He'll bleed it dry until nothing's left. You know it as well as I do." Her hands trembled as she reached for him, gripping his arm. "Then promise me this, if you live, don't carry his ghost with you any more. Don't let him haunt you for the rest of your days." Eli met her eyes, and for a moment, the hardness in him softened. He nodded once. "I'll try." She pressed a kiss to his cheek, tears in her eyes, then turned and walked away, her steps slow and heavy, as if she were leaving part of herself behind. As the afternoon waned, the shadows grew long, stretching like dark fingers across the dirt road. The entire town seemed to gather at the windows, the rooftops, the doorways, all waiting for the moment that would decide their fate. At the edge of the saloon, Cole Braddock stepped out into the light. His gang lingered in the shadows, but Cole himself walked tall, his spurs ringing with each step. His eyes locked on Eli across the street. For a long, terrible moment, they just stared at each other. Two men bound by blood, betrayal, and the weight of 15 years of history. The clock tower chimed once, the sound echoing through the silence. The hour of reckoning had arrived. Dusty Creek had never been so quiet. By the morning of the duel, every board in every building seemed to creak with dread. Families nailed their shutters shut, mothers drew their children close, and merchants locked up their shops as if bracing against a storm that no door could hold back. Even the wind seemed to hush itself, carrying with it only faint swirls of grit and the metallic taste of tension. The news had spread beyond the town. Riders had come in from ranches miles away, drawn by the promise of blood and legend. They crowded the edges of the street, leaning against hitching posts, filling the saloon balconies, their hats pulled low to hide both fear and excitement. Some whispered prayers. Others placed bets. Every face was turned toward the wide strip of dust that ran down the middle of town, the street that would soon become a grave. Sheriff Eli Carter walked through it slowly, his boots heavy, the earth crunching underfoot. His badge gleamed in the sun, though he felt its weight like a stone. He tipped his hat to the townsfolk as he passed, but no one spoke back. Their eyes were filled with something he knew too well, hope tangled with doubt. From the other end of town, the doors of the Silver Spur saloon banged open, and Cole Braddock stepped out into the light. His gang lingered behind him, shadows with rifles ready, but they didn't need to interfere. Cole wanted this duel clean. He wanted Eli's blood on his hands, not theirs. It wasn't just a matter of law versus lawlessness. Dusty Creek itself was torn in two. On one side, the shopkeepers, farmers, and families clung to Eli as their last line of defense. He had kept order when the desert tried to swallow them whole. He had buried their dead, protected their children, and stared down the guns of men twice as dangerous as himself. On the other side were the drifters, the broken men who saw Cole Braddock as their outlaw king. To them, he was the embodiment of defiance, the man who spit in the eye of railroads and bankers and rode free when the world tried to cage him. He represented something Eli never could, freedom without chains, even if it was soaked in blood. From behind the church doors, Pastor Whitlow whispered a trembling sermon to a handful of parishioners. From the saloon balconies, gamblers and ranch hands called out odds on who would walk away. The entire town had become a stage, and the duel was the only play. Eli spent the afternoon in the sheriff's office, oiling his revolver, running his fingers along the grooves in its steel as if memorizing them. He thought of his father, a farmer who had carried no weapon except a plow, and how proud he would have been, or how disappointed. On the wall hung a cracked mirror. Eli looked into it, barely recognizing the face staring back. Lines etched deep from years of desert sun, eyes weighed down by ghosts, a jaw set like iron. He thought of Abigail's words the night before, "Don't carry his ghost anymore." He strapped on the gun belt with a finality that chilled him. If he lived through sundown, maybe, just maybe, he'd try to lay down the badge. But first, Dusty Creek had to survive Braddock. Across the street, Cole Braddock prepared in his own way. He sat alone in the saloon, a bottle of whiskey untouched at his side. His men kept their distance, for they knew when their leader needed silence. Cole laid out his revolver on the table, the same gun he'd carried since the night he and Eli first rode together. The handle was worn smooth, the barrel dark from years of smoke and fire. He ran his hand across it almost tenderly. In his mind, he replayed the ranch house job, the night Eli turned away from him. He remembered the look in Eli's eyes, that mixture of disgust and sorrow. Cole had never forgiven it. Not because Eli betrayed him to the law, but because Eli had chosen a world of chains over the freedom they had once promised each other. Cole stood, holstered his weapon, and muttered under his breath, "This ends today. One way or the other." By late afternoon, the desert sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of copper and fire. Shadows stretched long across the street as if the town itself was preparing for a burial. The church bell tolled once. 6 o'clock. The townsfolk gathered tighter along the edges of the street. No one dared step into the center. A boy climbed onto a rooftop for a better view. His mother pulled him back down, tears streaking her face. Men leaned on their rifles, hands trembling, though they knew no bullet could stop what had already been set in motion. Sheriff Eli Carter stepped out of his office. Cole Braddock stepped from the saloon. The crowd fell silent. Eli's boots scraped the dust as he walked into the center of the street. He moved steady, each step measured, the leather of his duster flapping softly in the desert breeze. At the other end, Cole mirrored him. His spurs jingled with every step, his grin sharp as a knife. The two men closed the distance until 20 paces stretched between them, the traditional space of a duel, though neither had spoken the rules. Their eyes locked. The world seemed to narrow to that one strip of dirt, two figures facing each other under a sky burning red with sunset. Cole's voice carried across the silence. 15 years, Eli. 15 years since you left me in the dark." Eli's jaw tightened. "You made your choice, Cole. I made mine." Cole laughed bitterly. "Choice? You call betrayal a choice? You call sellin' out your brother to the hangman a choice?" Eli's hand twitched near his gun. "You stopped bein' my brother the night you spilled innocent blood. I couldn't ride with you after that." The tension crackled like lightning. Every eye in Dusty Creek was on them. The sun kissed the horizon. The sky turned blood-red. Shadows swallowed the town. Cole's grin faded, replaced by something colder, deadlier. "Then let the desert decide who was right." The two men squared their shoulders, hands hovering near their weapons. The air was so still, even the dust seemed frozen in place. The clock tower began to chime. 1, 2. Every soul in Dusty Creek held its breath. At the third chime, both men moved, hands flying to holsters, eyes blazing with years of fury, regret, and fate. The crowd gasped. The sound of steel clearing leather split the silence. And then, the street was deathly still. The clock tower told its fourth chime, and every sound that followed seemed magnified 100-fold. The scrape of boots against dirt, the faint wheeze of an old man's breath in the crowd, the flutter of a loose shutter against the wind. Dusty Creek had become a coffin of silence, waiting for a bullet to hammer in the first nail. Eli Carter's hand hovered inches above the worn grip of his Colt. Sweat beaded along his brow, trickling down his temple and catching in the edge of his beard. His heart pounded against his ribs like the war drums of some unseen army. 4 years he had faced gunmen, outlaws, killers who thought themselves untouchable, but never had his hand felt so heavy, so chained by the weight of history. Across the street, Cole Braddock's fingers flexed, relaxed, then curled again. His eyes gleamed with the fire of old betrayal, but beneath the hatred was something deeper, more human. He wasn't just here to kill a sheriff. He was here to kill the ghost of the man he once called brother. The crowd leaned forward, an entire town straining on the edge of breath. And then, the guns cleared leather. 2 cracks of thunder split the evening sky. The recoil jolted both men backward a half-step, the echoes ricocheting off the walls of Dusty Creek like lightning trapped in a canyon. For a heartbeat, no one knew who had fallen. Dust hung in the air like smoke after a battlefield charge. Eli staggered, his shoulder jerking as the bullet tore through his coat. He gritted his teeth, forcing his legs to remain steady. Blood spread dark against the fabric, but he kept his Colt steady, barrel locked on Cole. Cole, too, stumbled, a line of red cutting across his cheek where Eli's bullet had grazed him. He grinned through the sting, licking the blood from his lip. "Still quick, Eli. I'll give you that." The crowd erupted, some in gasps, others in cheers. The sound of humanity split in half like the town itself. Mothers shielded their children's eyes. Men clutched at their hats, their fists, their gambling slips. The desert had drunk its first taste of blood, but it was not yet finished. Cole fired again, his revolver barking flame, the shot smashing into the sign above the general store and sending splinters raining down. Eli ducked sideways, rolling behind a trough, water splashing as a bullet punched through the wood. The sheriff popped up, returned fire, 1, 2, 3 shots in rapid succession. Each missed Cole by inches, kicking up dust at his boots, tearing holes in the saloon wall. The outlaw advanced, calm and measured, like a wolf circling a wounded rival. "Don't make me drag this out, Eli," Cole shouted, voice echoing off the buildings. "You know how this ends. You know I ain't walking away empty-handed." Eli clenched his jaw, his left hand pressing against the wound in his shoulder. The blood was warm, slick, but he forced himself to rise, gun steady. His voice carried over the din. "You think this is about me, Cole? About us? Look around you. The whole town's watchin'. Every soul here knows it's about whether law still breathes in this land, or if men like you choke it dead." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavier than the smoke of gunpowder. Even Cole's men, watching from the saloon doorway, shifted uneasily. Cole sneered. "Law's just another word for chains. Out here, freedom's all a man's got." The duel became a deadly dance. Eli fired, Cole ducked. Cole lunged forward, Eli sidestepped, their boots tearing tracks in the dust as they circled one another. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, clearing space, each gunshot a crack of judgment in the fading day. Cole's men itched to intervene, their fingers tapping against rifle stocks, but his raised hand froze them in place. This was his fight, his story. Eli's breath grew ragged, his shoulders screaming with every movement, but his eyes never wavered. He remembered Abigail's voice, soft yet steady, "Don't carry his ghost anymore." He shouted across the street, "End it, Cole, before it swallows us both." But Cole only laughed, a harsh sound swallowed by gunfire as he fired again. The bullet whistled past Eli's ear, close enough to leave it ringing. At the 8th chime of the clock tower, Cole drew faster than Eli had ever seen him. The outlaw's revolver flashed, the bullet tearing through Eli's hat, spinning it into the dust. The crowd gasped as though the sheriff himself had fallen. Eli dropped to one knee, aiming upward, and squeezed the trigger. The shot hit true, smashing into Cole's thigh. The outlaw buckled, stumbled, but didn't fall. Instead, he roared with rage, steadying himself on the saloon's post, and fired back wildly. The slug buried itself into the dirt inches from Eli's boots. The crowd screamed, scattering backward. A horse broke free of its hitching post, galloping down the street in terror. Dust exploded around the duelists, turning the air into a haze of grit and smoke. Through it all, their eyes locked, two men bound by fate, unwilling to fall. Then, just as the clock told 9, another sound cut through the chaos, the piercing cry of a woman. Abigail rushed into the street, her skirts whipping in the wind, her hands raised. "Stop this madness! Enough blood has been spilled in this town." The crowd froze. Even Cole hesitated, his revolver still aimed, but his jaw tightening as recognition flickered across his face. Eli's eyes widened. "Abigail, get back!" he barked, his voice cracking with desperation. But Abigail stood firm, her body between the two men, her voice ringing out with fury and sorrow. "You were brothers once. Is this what's left of you? Murder in the dirt while children watch." For a moment, time itself seemed to falter. The duel had become something more than bullets. It was Judgment Day, for Eli, for Cole, and for Dusty Creek itself. Cole lowered his gun slightly, his chest heaving. "Move aside, darlin'. This ain't your fight." Abigail shook her head, tears glistening in the fading light. "You're wrong. This fight belongs to every soul you've torn apart, every widow you've made, every child you've left fatherless." Her words sliced sharper than any blade. The crowd murmured, voices rising like the first gusts of a storm. For the first time, Cole's certainty faltered. The bell tolled its final note, 10. In that instant, the silence broke again. A single shot rang out, louder than all the rest. Abigail gasped, her body jerking as the bullet tore past her. The crowd screamed. Eli lunged forward, fury boiling in his veins. Cole's revolver smoked in his hand, though his eyes burned with something not even hatred could mask. Dust swirled, blood dripped, and the fate of Dusty Creek hung on a knife's edge. But as the smoke cleared, no one yet knew who had fallen. The 10th chime faded into the sky, swallowed by the desert wind. For a heartbeat, the world seemed frozen, as if time itself held its breath to see which soul had been claimed by the bullet. Smoke coiled lazily from Cole Braddock's revolver, the acrid smell of gunpowder clinging to the air. Eli Carter's Colt trembled in his bloodied hand, his eyes wide, searching, desperate. And Abigail stood between them, her chest heaving, her face pale in the dying light of sundown. The crowd was silent. Every man, woman, and child in Dusty Creek felt the weight of that shot as though it had pierced their own flesh. Mothers clutched their children tighter, gamblers held their unfinished bets, and ranch hands forgot even to breathe. Then Abigail staggered. Her gasp tore through the silence. Her knees buckled, and she crumpled into the dirt. "Abigail!" Eli roared, his voice raw, tearing out of him like the cry of a wounded animal. He dropped to his knees beside her, Colt slipping from his hand into the dust. Blood seeped through the fabric of her dress, a crimson bloom spreading across her side. The crowd erupted. Shouts filled the air, women screamed, men surged forward, then stopped short, unwilling to step into the line of fire. Horses reared and stamped, their reins snapping against hitching posts. Dusty Creek was chaos incarnate. Cole froze. For the first time in years, the outlaw's face cracked, rage flickering into horror, disbelief, and something he had long buried, regret. His revolver lowered, his eyes locked on Abigail's pale face. I didn't mean," he muttered, the words barely audible over the uproar. Eli pressed his hand against the wound, his fingers slick with blood. "Stay with me, Abby, stay with me," he begged, his voice breaking. Her eyelids fluttered, her lips trembling as she tried to speak. Cole's men shifted uneasily by the saloon. One spat into the dust, muttering, "Boss, this ain't right," but none dared move. The law of the street duel had been broken, not by Eli, not by the town, but by fate's cruel hand. Eli's head snapped up, his eyes blazing with fire and hate. "You son of a bitch!" His hand groped for his revolver, but his shoulder screamed with agony as he lifted it. Cole staggered back, hands raised half in surrender, half in confusion. "Eli, I swear, she moved, I didn't." But the words only stoked the fire. Eli rose, dragging himself to his feet, revolver clutched tight, his whole body shaking. He no longer spoke as a sheriff, nor as a man of law. His voice was the roar of a wounded brother, a lover, a man who had lost too much to the dust. "You took everything from me, Cole. My trust, my peace, and now her blood." The crowd scattered further as Eli fired, bullets smashing into the wooden post beside Cole. Splinters exploded, grazing his cheek. Cole fired back instinctively, his shot kicking up dirt at Eli's boots. The duel was no longer about honor. It was a storm of grief and fury. Through the chaos, Abigail's faint voice cut through. "Eli." Her whisper was weak, barely audible, but it rooted Eli in place. He dropped to his knees again, clutching her hand, his revolver slipping from his grip a second time. "Don't you leave me," he begged, tears streaking down his dust-stained face. Abigail coughed, blood staining her lips. Yet her eyes, though heavy, were steady. "Don't let hate take you." Her words were a plea, soft but stronger than any bullet. Eli's chest heaved, torn between rage and love, between vengeance and the law he swore to uphold. Cole watched, frozen, his revolver limp at his side. For the first time, his swagger faltered, the outlaw mask cracking. He saw not just Eli, not just the woman bleeding in the dirt, but himself, years ago, standing in that same place when betrayal had set him on this path. The townsfolk began to move. Murmurs grew into shouts. "Sheriff, end him." "No. Get Abigail to Doc Murphy." Cole Braddock's cursed this town long enough. "Law or no law, kill him." The voices clashed, the town itself divided between justice and vengeance. Old men who remembered the days before Eli had worn the star clenched their fists. Women who had lost husbands to Cole's gang spat curses at the outlaw's name. But a few, hardened by the frontier, whispered that law was nothing but a chain in the desert wind. Cole's men reached for their guns, but the crowd turned on them, dozens of rifles and shotguns raised. "You fire, and this town buries you all," growled old Jeb, his one good eye glinting with fire as he cocked his rifle. For once, the balance of power shifted. Cole Braddock, the terror of the frontier, stood alone. Eli rose again, his body trembling with fury and grief. His revolver shook in his hand as he aimed it squarely at Cole's chest. "This ends tonight." Cole stared back, defiance and regret battling in his eyes. His voice cracked for the first time in years. "Then pull the damn trigger, Eli. Do it. End me." The sheriff's finger tightened on the trigger. The crowd held its breath. Even the wind seemed to die, the desert itself waiting. But Abigail's hand clutched Eli's wrist, her whisper cutting through his rage. "Don't become him." Eli's breath shuddered. He saw in her eyes the truth, that if he killed Cole now, in hatred and grief, he would lose more than just his soul. Dusty Creek wouldn't gain justice. It would inherit another outlaw, wearing a star. His hand wavered. His chest heaved. His entire life balanced on the edge of one bullet. Cole saw the hesitation, and in it, he found his chance. His revolver snapped up, faster than Eli expected. A shot cracked like lightning. Eli staggered, the force of the bullet spinning him sideways. Pain exploded across his ribs, his body collapsing into the dust beside Abigail. The sheriff gasped, blood soaking his vest. The crowd screamed in outrage, surging forward, but Cole fired into the dirt at their feet, forcing them back. His voice rang out, harsh, desperate. "Stay back. Every damn one of you." Eli coughed, blood bubbling on his lips, his vision swimming. He reached for Abigail's hand, clinging to it with what little strength remained. His voice was hoarse but steady. "Don't let it end like this." Cole stood above him, revolver still smoking, chest heaving. His eyes darted across the crowd, then back to Eli, then down to Abigail's fading face. For the first time, his mask shattered completely. He looked less like an outlaw and more like a man haunted by his own reflection. The crowd surged again, fury overtaking fear. Shots rang out, not at Eli, but at Cole. Bullets tore into the saloon walls, shattered windows, and ricocheted off barrels. The outlaw ducked, firing wildly into the air before retreating toward his horse. "Cole Braddock, you won't leave Dusty Creek alive," a ranch hand shouted. Cole swung onto his horse, spurring it hard. Bullets chased him down the street, kicking up dust, but the outlaw rode like a demon, disappearing into the desert night. His men scattered, some gunned down in the chaos, others fleeing into alleys and out across the plains. Dusty Creek roared with rage and grief, the echoes of gunfire mingling with cries for justice. In the center of it all, Eli Carter lay bleeding, his badge gleaming faintly in the dying light. Abigail still clutched his hand, her breathing shallow but alive. The townsfolk rushed forward now, Doc Murphy pushing through with his bag, old Jeb hauling Eli upright, mothers sobbing as they shielded children's eyes. "Get them both inside," Doc barked. "Now." They carried Eli and Abigail into the sheriff's office, the once quiet place now a storm of voices, prayers, and fear. Eli's vision blurred, darkness creeping at the edges. His last sight before unconsciousness claimed him was Abigail's pale face beside his, her lips still moving with words he could barely hear. "Don't give up. Don't let him win." And then, the sheriff of Dusty Creek fell into blackness. Outside, the town boiled with fury, rallying against the outlaw who had once seemed untouchable. Men sharpened knives, women loaded rifles, and children whispered of vengeance. But out in the desert, under the blood-red sunset, Cole Braddock rode hard, the shadow of regret and wrath chasing him across the sands. He knew Dusty Creek would not rest until one of them lay cold in the dust. The final duel had not ended. It had only begun. And the next time Eli and Cole faced one another, only one would rise from the dirt. The night after the duel hung heavy over Dusty Creek. The moon was a pale sliver, barely enough to illuminate the dirt-stained streets. The town was restless, its people pacing, whispering, waiting. Dusty Creek had always known fear, but now it knew something else, rage. Inside the sheriff's office, lanterns burned low. Eli Carter lay pale and still on a cot, his chest rising unevenly. Sweat glistened on his brow, his breath rattling as though each one might be his last. Beside him, Abigail lay on another bed, her side bandaged, her face drawn with pain yet fierce in spirit. Doc Murphy worked tirelessly, his gnarled hand steady as he stitched, cleaned, and muttered under his breath. "Damn outlaw tore through you like paper. If you were any weaker, Eli, you'd be 6 feet under already." Eli stirred, his voice raw but firm. "I ain't dead yet, document. Not till this town is safe." Beyond the office walls, Dusty Creek gathered like a storm. The saloon, once a place of laughter and cards, was now a war council. Ranchers leaned over tables, maps spread wide, whiskey glasses untouched. Blacksmiths, miners, and drifters all spoke in angry tones, voices rising with every memory of a brother, husband, or son lost to Cole Braddock's gang. "This town won't stand another sunrise with that devil breathing," growled Hank Mallory, his fist slamming the table. "He'll be back," muttered another, "and next time he'll bring hell with him." "We take the fight to him," spat Jeb, his one eye flashing. "Hunt him down before he hunts us." 4 years, Dusty Creek had lived in the shadow of fear. But Abigail's blood, Eli's near fall, and the brazen lawlessness of the duel lit a fire no outlaw could put out. Abigail refused to remain silent in her bed. Propped against pillows, pale but fierce, she spoke with quiet conviction. "You can't meet hate with more hate," she told a cluster of townsfolk who had come to see the wounded sheriff. Her voice was weak but carried weight. "Cole wants to drag us down into the dust with him. If we forget who we are, if we become killers, then we've already lost." Her words calmed some, but not all. Many left shaking their heads, muttering that words wouldn't stop bullets. Yet others, seeing her strength despite her wound, began to believe there might be another way, justice, not vengeance. Eli, drifting between fevered dreams and brief moments of wakefulness, heard her voice each time. It steadied him more than Doc Murphy's medicine ever could. Far beyond Dusty Creek, Cole Braddock sat by a fire in the desert. His men were scattered, those who survived limping back to the outlaws' camp with fear in their eyes. Some cursed their leader, others whispered that Dusty Creek had grown too strong, that Cole had finally pushed too far. Cole said nothing. He sat in silence, the flames casting shadows across his weathered face. The outlaw's mask was gone. What remained was a man wrestling with ghosts. He saw Abigail's pale face every time he closed his eyes. He heard Eli's voice, filled with fire and grief. For the first time in years, Cole wondered if his path had been a mistake. But just as quick, anger surged back into his chest. "They think they can defy me," he muttered, rising to his feet. His men looked up, wary. "They think they can spit on the Braddock name. No. I'll burn that town to ash before I let it stand against me." The firelight caught in his eyes, and the men knew, whatever sliver of regret had touched their leader was gone. What remained was vengeance. Back in Dusty Creek, Eli awoke in the dead of night. The pain in his ribs burned like fire, but his mind was sharp. He forced himself upright, ignoring Doc Murphy's curses. Abigail stirred, reaching for his arm. "You need rest," she whispered. "What I need," Eli rasped, "is to remember why I wear this badge." He pulled the star from his vest pocket, its metal dulled by blood and dust. Turning it over in his hand, he thought of the men and women depending on him, of the law carved out of blood and sacrifice in a land where chaos thrived. "I swore an oath," he said, voice steady despite the pain. "Not to kill. Not to hate. To stand. To fight for justice, even if it breaks me." Abigail's eyes softened, and for the first time since the duel, a faint smile touched her lips. "Then Dusty Creek still has hope." By morning, word spread through town that Eli Carter had risen from his bed, wounded but unbroken. The sight of their sheriff, pale yet standing on the wooden steps of his office, stirred something deep in the townsfolk. "I won't lie to you," Eli said, his voice hoarse but strong. "Cole Braddock will come again. He'll come with fire, with guns, with every ounce of hate he's got. But we're not just a town waiting to be buried. We're Dusty Creek. And we stand together." A cheer rose from the crowd, ragged, defiant, alive. Farmers, ranchers, blacksmiths, gamblers, even children shouted until their voices shook the air. Dusty Creek had been afraid for too long. Now it was ready to fight. That same sunrise, Cole Braddock mounted his horse, his men reluctantly rallying behind him. His voice cut through the desert air. "We ride at dusk. Dusty Creek dies tonight." The men swallowed their fear. They knew the town would be ready, but they also knew Cole's wrath was more dangerous than any sheriff. To ride with him was to march into hell itself. Yet none dared defy him. The desert wind carried his words far across the plains, as if warning the town itself. As the sun bled across the horizon, Dusty Creek prepared. Windows were boarded, rifles cleaned, prayers whispered. Children clung to mothers, and men stood shoulder to shoulder. In the sheriff's office, Eli tightened the strap of his holster despite Doc Murphy's protests. Abigail watched, silent but steady, her hand resting near her wound. "Tonight," Eli said, his voice quiet but firm, "it ends. One way or another." And out in the distance, riding hard through the desert, Cole Braddock's silhouette appeared against the dying sun. Dusty Creek was about to face its reckoning. The sun was low, sinking into the desert like a dying ember. Dusty Creek braced itself, every shadow stretched long across the dusty street. Boards nailed over windows. Barrels rolled into place for cover. Rifles checked and loaded. Mothers whispered prayers while holding their children close. The town was no longer a collection of strangers and drifters, it was an army. Ordinary folk turned into defenders, their hands trembling but resolute. The saloon became a barricade, the church a lookout, the blacksmith shop a fortress. Dusty Creek was alive with one thought: tonight, we fight. Eli Carter stood on the steps of the sheriff's office, a pale figure against the orange sky. His bandaged chest rose with effort, each breath a battle of its own. Yet his hand rested steady on the grip of his Colt. His eyes swept over the townsfolk, his people. "You see that sky?" he called, his voice hoarse but unyielding. "It's red, 'cause the sun's bleeding out. Braddock thinks it's bleeding for us. He's wrong. Tonight, we show him Dusty Creek ain't his to burn." A cheer erupted, raw and defiant. Then came the sound, the thunder of hooves rolling in from the desert. Dust rose in the distance, a storm of men and horses riding fast. The Braddock gang. At their head was Cole himself, his black hat low, his long coat whipping behind him like a shadow come alive. His eyes burned, and even from afar, the town could feel the weight of his fury. He raised his hand, and his riders fanned out like wolves circling their prey. "Tonight we end it." Cole's voice carried, deep and venomous. "No law, no sheriff, no mercy. Dusty Creek dies." The outlaws roared, guns lifted to the sky. The silence broke with a crack, one rifle from the bell tower of the church. An outlaw dropped from his saddle, his scream cut short in the dust. The battle began. Gunfire exploded on both sides, echoing through the narrow street. Bullets slammed into wooden facades, shattering glass, ripping shingles from roofs. Horses screamed as their riders fell. Smoke filled the air, and the smell of gunpowder mixed with sweat and fear. The townsfolk fired from windows, from rooftops, from behind barrels and wagons. Miners with shotguns, ranchers with rifles, blacksmiths swinging pistols in hands calloused from iron. Women stood beside men, steadying their aim. Children huddled in cellars, clutching each other as thunder rolled above. Dusty Creek was no longer afraid, it was fighting. Through the smoke, Eli saw him, Cole Braddock, cutting through the chaos like a storm. His revolvers spat fire, each shot finding a mark, each man who stood against him falling hard. He was no mere outlaw, he was a force of rage, a storm given flesh. Eli stepped down into the street. His legs trembled, his chest burned, but his hand never faltered. He fired once, twice. One outlaw fell, another's hat flew into the dust. Cole's eyes locked on him. The world seemed to pause. Gunfire roared around them, but in that moment there were only two men, the sheriff and the outlaw, bound by fate. "Carter!" Cole's voice ripped across the din. "You should have stayed in your grave." Eli answered with a bullet that nicked Cole's coat, close enough to sting. The outlaw grinned, a savage, wild grin. "Good," Cole spat. "Then let's finish this." The duel between law and lawlessness spread through the town like wildfire. Cole's men fought with feral desperation, but the townsfolk held. Every street corner became a battlefield. In the saloon, Hank Mallory led a charge, smashing through the front doors and firing point-blank into two outlaws who tried to breach the barricade. In the blacksmith's yard, sparks flew as hot iron became makeshift weapons. On rooftops, sharpshooters rained lead down into the street, cutting down riders as they galloped by. But the gang fought hard. They were seasoned killers, hardened by years of blood and dust. For every outlaw that fell, a townsman fell too. Dusty Creek bled, its people screaming, fighting, dying. Abigail, pale but unbroken, had refused to stay hidden. From the sheriff's window, she fired steady shots, her aim sure despite the pain in her side. Each bullet was an act of defiance, each one whispering to Cole Braddock, "You will not win." The fight reached its peak when Cole's men set fire to the stables. Flames roared into the sky, smoke billowing black over the town. Horses stampeded, panicked, breaking through fences, scattering in chaos. The firelight painted Dusty Creek in shades of hell. Cole charged through the inferno, his revolvers blazing. He came for the sheriff's office, for Eli, for the heart of the town. Eli staggered into the street, his star glinting in the firelight. He drew, fired. Cole rolled from his saddle, the bullet grazing his arm. In a heartbeat he was back up, advancing on foot, his shadow stretching long through the smoke. "You can't stop me, Carter," Cole bellowed. "You ain't got the strength left in you." Eli coughed, blood on his lips, but his eyes were iron. "Strength ain't what keeps me standing, Braddock. It's the law. And the law don't die easy." Their guns raised in unison, barrels gleaming in the fire's glow. The townsfolk fought on, but all eyes turned to the center of the street. Sheriff Eli Carter and Cole Braddock faced each other, the world narrowing to a single dusty stretch of road. The fire crackled. Smoke curled. The town held its breath. Two men. One law. One vengeance. And as the clock struck midnight, both pulled their triggers. It ends in the thunder. The gunshots still echoed through the canyon walls long after the triggers were pulled. Then came the silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that swallowed the cries of battle and the roar of flames. Dust swirled in the street like the breath of ghosts. The people of Dusty Creek froze where they stood. Fingers gripped triggers, breaths caught in throats. Their eyes fixed on the two figures in the heart of the street, Sheriff Eli Carter and Cole Braddock, both standing in a haze of smoke. Eli staggered, blood dripping from his sleeve, his chest heaving. His Colt hung loose at his side, the barrel smoking. Across from him, Cole stood rigid, his revolver still aimed, a strange smile curling his lips. For a heartbeat, it seemed neither man had been touched. Then, slowly, Cole Braddock dropped to his knees. His hand slipped from his revolver. Blood spread across his shirt like a dark flower blooming in the firelight. He coughed once, then twice, his eyes burning with rage even as strength fled him. "You can't kill a shadow," he rasped, blood staining his teeth. "Shadows always come back." With that, the notorious outlaw collapsed face first into the dirt. The ground trembled with the weight of his fall. The townsfolk erupted, not with cheers, but with cries of disbelief, relief, grief. Some fell to their knees, clutching each other. Others wept openly, the tension of hours crashing down all at once. Mothers pulled children from cellars, fathers holstered their guns with trembling hands. The Braddock gang, leaderless and broken, fled into the night. Their hooves thundered into the desert, leaving behind their dead and dying. Dusty Creek had stood its ground. Eli, swaying on his feet, holstered his weapon and took one shaky step forward. The world tilted. He stumbled, nearly falling, but Abigail rushed from the sheriff's office, her face pale but her eyes alive with fire. She caught him under the arm, steadying him. "It's over," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You did it, Eli. You saved them." Eli's lips curled in a faint, bitter smile. "Saved 'em, for now." His knees buckled, and the sheriff collapsed into Abigail's arms. By dawn, Dusty Creek was a scarred but breathing thing. The fire at the stables had been beaten back, though the charred remains smoldered. Broken glass littered the streets. Windows hung shattered, doors splintered, walls riddled with holes. The church bell was cracked, its silent face looming over a battered town. Bodies lay covered in sheets, lined along the street. Townsfolk moved quietly among them, heads bowed, voices hushed. The price of survival was written in the stillness of their movements, the hollow look in their eyes. Inside the saloon, the wounded filled every corner. Bandages soaked through with blood, whispered prayers over fevered brows, the groans of pain echoing beneath the creak of the floorboards. Abigail tended to Eli in a corner room. His fever burned, his breath shallow, the wound in his chest angry and red. She pressed a cool cloth to his brow, whispering words only he could hear. "You can't leave them now, Eli," she murmured. "You can't leave me." But the sheriff's eyes stayed closed, his breaths ragged. Out in the street, the body of Cole Braddock lay stretched across a wooden table. Men gathered around, wary, almost fearful to stand too close. Even in death, he seemed larger than life, a shadow that might rise again at any moment. "Should burn him," one man muttered. "No," Hank Mallory said firmly. "We bury him deep. Law's still law, even for devils like him." They carried Braddock's body to the edge of town, where the desert began. As the grave was dug, whispers rippled among the crowd. Stories already began to twist, that Cole had smiled when he died, that his last words promised vengeance, that his ghost would walk the desert until Dusty Creek was ash. By the time the last shovelful of dirt hit the grave, a legend had been born. Cole Braddock was dead, but in the hearts of men, his shadow still lingered. Though the outlaw was gone, peace did not immediately settle over Dusty Creek. With grief came anger, and with anger came blame. Some blamed the sheriff for not stopping Braddock sooner. Others blamed the townsfolk for hesitating when the gang first arrived. Old grudges resurfaced, bitter words were exchanged in hushed tones. The unity forged in fire began to crack beneath the weight of loss. Hank Mallory stood in the saloon, his voice raised above the mutters. "Enough. We ain't tearing ourselves apart. Sheriff Carter gave near his life for this town. We honor that, or we ain't worth the blood we spilled." The room fell quiet, but the unease lingered. Fear still gnawed at the people. They had faced Cole Braddock and won, but they had also seen what it cost. That night, Eli stirred in his bed, his fever breaking just enough for his eyes to flicker open. Abigail sat beside him, exhaustion etched into her face. "You came back," she whispered, tears brimming. Eli's voice was rough, barely audible. "How long was I gone?" 2 days. Dusty Creek's holding together. "But Eli," she hesitated, her voice cracking. "They need you. They're scared. They're looking for someone to tell them it's going to be all right." Eli stared at the ceiling, the weight of every lost soul pressing down on him. His hand reached for his badge on the nightstand, his fingers brushing the cold metal. "Not sure I can give 'em that any more," he muttered. "Not after what it cost." Abigail caught his hand, squeezing it tight. Then don't give them words. Give them you. That's enough. Just before dawn, a lone rider appeared on the horizon. Dust covered him head to toe, his horse lathered with sweat. He rode into town with urgency, dismounting in front of the saloon. His face was grim, his eyes darting to every shadow. "Where's the sheriff?" he demanded. Hank Mallory stepped forward. "He's recovering. Speak your piece." The rider's voice dropped low. "You think killing Braddock ended this? You're wrong. Cole wasn't the only one. His brother's out there. Jonah Braddock. And he's raising men, more than Cole ever had." He swore he'd burn Dusty Creek to the ground. The saloon went silent. The stranger's eyes swept the room, hard and certain. "You've won a battle. But the war's just begun." That night, as the town tried to sleep amidst the ashes of battle, Eli Carter stood weakly at his window, staring out at the desert. His chest still ached, but his mind was sharper than it had been in weeks. Cole Braddock was gone, but another shadow was rising. Jonah Braddock, darker, angrier, bloodthirsty for revenge. Eli gripped his badge, the metal cold against his palm. He thought of Abigail, of the children hiding in cellars, of the men who had carried their dead into the sunrise. He had given nearly everything to save Dusty Creek once. Now he would have to do it again. The closes with Eli whispering to the night, his voice a vow. "If he's coming, I'll be waiting." The desert at dawn was quiet, too quiet. A hush hung over Dusty Creek like the world itself was holding its breath. The townsfolk rose from uneasy beds, their eyes drawn westward, to where the horizon shimmered under the first light. Word had spread quickly, Jonah Braddock was coming. They gathered in silence. Men with rifles leaned against posts, women clutching children to their skirts, old men with faces like weathered leather staring grimly into the dust. The memory of Cole Braddock's assault still burned raw in their minds, and now they waited for the storm his brother promised to bring. Inside the sheriff's office, Eli Carter buckled on his gun belt with stiff, deliberate movements. The wound in his chest still pulled at every breath, but he pushed the pain down. His eyes were steady, his face carved from stone. Abigail stood nearby, worry written in the lines of her brow. "You shouldn't even be standing," she whispered. "I don't have a choice," Eli said, sliding his Colt into its holster. "If I don't ride out, Jonah will bring hell down on this town." Abigail stepped closer, her hand trembling as it brushed his arm. "Then don't ride alone." Eli met her eyes, saw the fire in them, the plea, the love. His heart ached, but he shook his head. "This ends with me and him. No one else." The sound came first, a low rumble, like thunder rolling over the desert. Then the riders appeared, a line of black silhouettes against the rising sun. Dust billowed behind them, turning the sky red and gold. At their head rode Jonah Braddock. If Cole had been a wolf, Jonah was a storm. Broad-shouldered, scarred, his eyes blazing with hate, he sat tall in the saddle, a rifle strapped across his back. His men flanked him, a wild, ragged army of drifters, gunmen, and cutthroats drawn to the promise of blood and vengeance. They halted at the edge of town. Jonah's gaze swept over Dusty Creek, then fixed on the figure stepping into the street. Sheriff Eli Carter, alone, standing tall though the weight of death hung heavy on him. Jonah dismounted slowly, his boots sinking into the dust. He spat into the dirt, then called out, his voice a growl. "You killed my brother." Eli's voice rang out, clear and steady. "Your brother chose his path. Just like you're choosing yours." Jonah's lip curled. "You think I'll let Dusty Creek live after this? No, Sheriff. I'll burn your town to ash. And I'll start with you." The street became a stage, every eye fixed on the two men who now faced each other. Jonah's hand hovered near his revolver, Eli's fingers brushing the worn grip of his Colt. "Let's end this," Eli said. Jonah sneered. "Gladly." The air thickened, every heartbeat loud as a drum. The sun rose higher, glinting off steel. The world seemed to shrink to that one dusty street, that single moment, as two men prepared to decide the fate of a town. Then, in a blur of motion, Jonah drew. His revolver cleared leather, the barrel flashing in the morning light. Eli's Colt barked a split second later. The shots cracked the silence like lightning splitting the sky. Dust kicked up between them. A gasp swept through the crowd. Jonah staggered, a red bloom spreading across his side, but he didn't fall. With a snarl, he charged forward, firing wildly, bullets ripping into walls, shattering glass, sending splinters flying. Eli ducked, fired again, the recoil jolting through his wounded chest. Jonah roared in fury, pain fueling his rage as he closed the distance. The duel became a brawl. Jonah slammed into Eli, knocking the Colt from his grip. The sheriff hit the dirt hard, the air blasting from his lungs. Jonah loomed over him, raising his revolver to finish it. But Eli rolled, the shot searing past his ear. He grabbed Jonah's wrist, twisting, forcing the outlaw's hand away as the gun fired into the sky. The crowd screamed, the thunder of violence filling the street. With a grunt, Eli drove his fist into Jonah's jaw. The outlaw staggered, then swung back, his fist smashing against Eli's wounded chest. Agony exploded through the sheriff's body, but he refused to fall. They grappled in the dust, two men locked in a struggle bigger than themselves. Law against lawlessness, order against chaos, brother against brother's shadow. At last, Eli's hand found the grip of his fallen Colt, half buried in the dirt. He pulled it free as Jonah raised a knife, the blade glinting in the sun. Jonah roared, bringing the knife down. Eli fired. The shot tore through Jonah's chest. His eyes widened, the knife slipping from his grasp. He stumbled backward, staring at the sheriff with something almost like disbelief. "You ain't stronger," Jonah rasped, blood bubbling at his lips. "Just more stubborn." Then he collapsed, the dust rising around him as silence claimed the street once more. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the townsfolk erupted, rushing forward, voices raised in disbelief and relief. The Braddock gang, seeing their leader fall, broke and scattered into the desert. Eli stood over Jonah's body, his Colt still smoking, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. His knees nearly buckled, but Abigail was suddenly there, her hand steadying him. "It's over," she whispered. Eli's gaze stayed on Jonah, the last Braddock. He shook his head slowly. "No. It'll never be over. Men like them, they'll always come. But so will men like us." In the days that followed, Dusty Creek began to heal. The dead were buried, the wounded tended. Ashes were cleared, walls rebuilt, hope rekindled. The scars would remain, but so would the memory of courage. Eli Carter walked the streets, slower now, his badge still gleaming on his chest. People tipped their hats, nodded in respect. He was no longer just the sheriff. He was a symbol, a reminder that even in the darkest times, law and honor could stand tall. At sunset, he and Abigail stood at the edge of town, the desert stretching endlessly before them. The wind carried the scent of dust and sage, the sound of life slowly returning. "You could leave," Abigail said softly. "Start over somewhere new. No one would blame you." Eli looked out at the horizon, the endless expanse of the west. Then he shook his head. "This town needs a sheriff. And I reckon I need it too." That night, Eli saddled his horse and rode out under the stars. Not to chase outlaws or fight battles, but to feel the land, the freedom of the frontier. The desert stretched wide and wild, the sky a blanket of fire and diamonds. He rode not as a man running from shadows, but as one who had faced them and stood tall. Dusty Creek was his town, his home, his burden and his blessing. And as long as the West remained wild, Sheriff Eli Carter would ride. Because in the end, law was not a badge. It was a man's promise, written in dust, blood, and the rising sun.